Hello, everyone, and welcome to our presentation. Today, we will discuss two chapters from the book Global Business Strategy, which is written by Kazuyuki Motohashi. I will tell a little bit more about Chapter 3, the changes in the global economic environment, and Vivi will tell a little bit more about Chapter 4, the comparison of economic institutions in China and India. Now, before I go and explain chapter 3, I'd like to quickly explain to you guys what the book Global Business Strategy is about. This is to give you an idea of how the chapters relate to the book. So, the book is actually a series of theories and cases for corporations in developed countries for designing their strategies to maximize opportunities and to minimize threats. So, in essence, it's about understanding of business environments in emerging economies, and it's from the perspective of a corporation from a developed economy. So now, chapter three. So, chapter three, changes in the global economic environment, is structured in three subtopics. So this chapter explains how the global economic environment is developing and how this environment is changing. So the first section will explain how the long-term economic growth by country has been in the last 50 years. So that's a historical perspective. The second section will illustrate the global economic forecast up to 2030. So that's the future of the global economic environment. And the last section, the competitive rankings, is a section that discusses the competitiveness of these countries and why one country is more competitive than the other. And this is based on the World Competitiveness Yearbook. And after discussing these three sections, I will provide a conclusion, wrap up all the theory, and I will also introduce my own opinion and reflect on what was written by Motohashi. So first, the section long-term economic growth by country. So the author states that economic growth is mainly displayed by the GDP per capita of a country. And he states explicitly that measuring the GDP per capita is the most efficient and the most correct way of explaining economic growth of a country. And to show the reader how the economic growth can be measured and what the history is of the different countries of economic growth, he separates the GDP per capita in two graphs. One graph shows the GDP per capita of developed countries, and the author says that a developed country has a GDP per capita which is above $20,000. And the other graph is the GDP per capita below $20,000. And this is of countries that are not developed yet, but they are still developing. So this is the first graph of the developed countries. And as you can see, this graph shows the per capita GDP of the developed countries from 1950 till 2008. And what is remarkable in this graph, in the last 60 years, you can see that there is a general trend that shows these countries and these regions. So that's the United States, Singapore and Hong Kong, Japan, West Europe, and Korea and Taiwan together that these 5 regions or countries all show a increase in GDP per capita. So they're all growing. However, they're all not growing as fast as each other. So if we take, for example, Singapore, which the author also highlights, Singapore and Hong Kong show a really strong growth. So Singapore starts with the other countries in 1950s with a rather low GDP per capita. It's around 3,000, whereas the United States is at 10,000 and Western Europe at 5,000. And as you can see in the graph, Singapore and Hong Kong catch up in 50 years' time with um, Japan and Europe around 2000. They have the same GDP per capita as these countries. And around 2008, Singapore and Hong Kong almost catch up with the United States, who have the highest GDP per capita. And these were the developed countries. Now let's look at the developing countries. So this graph shows a few more regions. That's East Europe, China, India, Russia, ASEAN. So that's the association of East Asian countries, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. And all these countries are relevant to the paper, but the author explains a remarkable trend in the last 60 years for economic growth. And that is in specifically Russia and China and India. So these countries, especially China and India, start at a very low GDP per capita. So compared to Russia, China, and India, they start low. Well, then in about 50 years' time, China and India catch up with Russia. And now China is actually at the same level almost as Russia. So we see a really big growth from these Asian countries. So China, India, but also the other Southeast Asian countries. Well, that's of course not for nothing. There's a reason why some countries grow faster than other countries. And the author Motohashi explains this by the determinants of economic growth. And in chapter 3, he states there are basically 2 economic growth theories. One is the classical economic growth theory, and the other is the theory of endogenous economic growth. And these 2 theories are very similar. However, they differ on one aspect, and that's the effect of technological innovations, whether this is exogenous or endogenous. And exogenous meaning that the technological innovations are the result, are the consequence of economic growth. So they are a byproduct. And endogenous means that technological innovations and advancements are the source and the cause of economic growth. And that's how these 2 theories are different from each other. The classical states that economic growth will lead to technological innovations, whereas the theory of endogenous economic growth states that the R&D activities and technological improvements will cause economic growth. And now, after the history of economic growth is explained, the author provides a forecast of the global economic environment. So how will this environment change? What will the future look like? And he makes, the author provides us a forecast up to 2030. And this is a long-term economic growth model. And it shows the changes in shares of GDP from 1980 up to 2030. And this model is based upon 80 countries, and it includes 90% of world's overall GDP. And the mother makes the author makes the predictions based upon the previous growth patterns and other financial data. So if we take a look at the growth model, um, we see here that for every decade, 1980, 1990, 2000, and 2010, the graph shows the shares of GDP. So if we take a look at 1980, we see the red bar, which is Western Europe, is at that moment has around 40% of world's GDP. It produces 40% of the GDP in total. And for example, North America, the green in 1980 shows around 30% of the GDP. And for every decade, you see that this proportion, these shares of GDP change. And the author distinguishes again between developed countries and developing countries. And as you can see here, the developing countries in 2030 have only a combined share of around 30%, whereas in 1980, the combined share of the developed countries, so that's Western Europe, Japan, and North America, is around 70%, 70 to 80%. So this is one of the predictions of the author, that the GDP share of the developed countries will relatively decrease compared to the developing countries, like especially China and India will grow. Now, in the last section of chapter 3 is the competitive rankings. And yearly, the IMD, which is a profound business school in Switzerland, publishes the World's Competitive Yearbook. And this is a book that illustrates which countries are internationally competitive. And it shows 60 countries. And these countries are ranked based upon 248 weighted factors. So why is a country competitive? That's because of these factors, and these can be qualitative factors, which is a survey which is filled in by managers from multinationals, or by quantitative data, and this is hard statistical data, mainly economic data. And these factors are inspired by the famously Porter's diamond. And these factors are, of course, it's of course a high numbers in factors, but they are not completely random. They're based upon 4 pillars. That's economic performance, government efficiency, business efficiency, and infrastructure. Now that we know that how the chapter 3 is constructed, I'd like to show a quick recap of the chapter. So what is the essence of the chapter? What can you take away from it? So according to the author, Motohashi, over time, the GDP distribution between developed and developing countries has flattened. However, it is still far from an equal distribution. So as we had seen in the graph, the share of the developing countries is growing compared to the share of the developed countries. So that it is getting more equal, but in 2030 it will still not be that equal. So one of the predictions of the author is that actually in 2030, the share of GDP developed countries will decrease from 80 to 40%. And this indicates the importance of newly industrializing countries like China and India. However, the cultural and administrative distances that determine competitiveness, which are mentioned in the index, are likely to remain constant. And this is because the flow of international people is not as high as that of developed countries. So that, and the author says that therefore globalization, flow of these people, will not affect the developing countries as much as the developed countries. And because of that, the cultural and administrative distance will remain constant, which you need to keep in mind when you are as a multinational doing business in other countries. So what does Motohashi actually suggest after providing you these theories is that global strategies for multinationals should be focused on newly industrializing countries. So that's India, China. However, the specific global strategies should be adopted because of cultural and administrative differences between these countries. So now my point of view, what I have to say about chapter 3 and what I think maybe lacks quality and what is useful. So the first thing to notice is that the data used in this chapter is outdated. It's from 2015. And that makes the strategies that the author provides and suggests based on these predictions that these strategies can be riskful. So for example, the author predicts that China's GDP will surpass the United States GDP in 2030. However, the current predictions of the International Monetary Fund are already that in 2027 this will happen and not in 2030. And besides the errors in these predictions, at the moment, what is the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic? So will this alter the distribution between developed and developing countries? Will the pandemic cause developing countries to grow harder and more easily, or is it the other way around? And besides that, the another point of criticism is that the GDP per capita may not be the only true welfare index. So the author states that to look at welfare, to look at economic growth, you should look at GDP per capita. However, there's more to that, I personally believe. So here's, for example, the World Happiness Report in 2020, which shows the happiness the average happiness of citizens of a country, and the National Welfare Index, which takes into account um, other statistics and statistic data than just economic data. Um, and for the economic data, GDP per capita is something that's average, but it does not say something about distribution of an income in a country. So in America, the average income is really high, but um, that does not mean that everyone is rich. So you have a few percent in the top of America that will earn enormous amounts of money, millionaires, billionaires, and then there's the middle income of people that earn a relatively low salary. The average income in that case will be high, but it's not statistically representing the middle income of people in these countries. Since this is way lower, so that's something you should take in mind. And for me to conclude chapter 3 is I'd like to suggest that theory that is presented by Motohashi is valuable in an economic sense, when you take into account the errors in his predictions. However, for a company, if you are planning to enter a new country, the broader sense of welfare is not considered by Motohashi, so it fails to be a holistic point of view. So it does say something about the GDP per capita, the average, but it does not say something about the happiness of people and their middle income compared to their average income. So that's something the book lacks. This was actually the end of my part of the presentation. Now I'd like to give the floor to Vivi, my colleague, and she will explain chapter 4.
It is necessary for global business strategies to conform to business environments in target countries and regions since there are still significant barriers in the form of national borders. These barriers come from the differences in business environments that consist of cultural, administrative, geographical, and economic factors. While countries have codified formal institutions such as laws, they also have informal institutions such as the code of conduct and practices that are as important. Thus, corporations and individuals within economic society don't necessarily abide by and behave accordingly to the formal institutions. Instead, informal restraints such as customs and taboos often determine their behaviors. This tendency is particularly apparent in developing nations such as China and India because these nations have been slow to enact various rules regarding economic transactions. Moreover, both formal and informal institutions in various countries can be characterized as scheme rules for conducting economic activities. Without a proper understanding of these scheme rules, engagement of global business strategy is unlikely to happen. Now, let us make a comparative institution analysis of China and India. The People's Republic of China was established in 1949 as a communist country under the leadership of Mao Zedong. Under the patronage of then Soviet Union, a socialist state was created, but the Cultural Revolutions which lasted from 1966 to 1976 caused great turmoil. With the death of Mao Zedong in 1976, Deng Xiaoping took over the country's leadership and in 1978 began implementing a policy of reform and opening up the nation that started the nation's economic development. Deng Xiaoping's economic policies enabled economic development by attracting foreign corporations, and in the 90s, China implemented full-scale policies to further open the country's economy. As a result, direct foreign investment in China skyrocketed, and the number of Japanese companies investing in China grew rapidly, contributing to the country's prestigious title, the Factory of the World. On the other hand, the Republic of China gained independence from the British Empire in 1947. Each state in India has an independent economic system, and taxes and regulations are extraordinarily complex. In 1980, the regulations were relaxed to allow partial participation of foreign capital, but the impact of that relaxation was very limited compared to China. Because of the lack of basic infrastructure such as roads and electricity, India has many handicaps as a manufacturing base. Yet, recently, the rapid growth of the IT service industry, primarily in software development and business process outsourcing, has greatly changed India's image internationally, making the country known as the world's software developer. This figure shows the per capita GDP trends for China and India. The per capita GDP was about the same for both countries until 1990, but after that time, China's growth began to outstrip that of India. As of 2010, the per capita GDP was USD 400 for China versus India's USD 1300, showing that There's a huge gap. The source of this gap is thought to be the difference in policies for attracting foreign capital. Meanwhile, the FDI in China has been on an increasing trend since the 90s as opposed to India, which had no visible direct foreign investment until about 2005 and only began to grow from 2006. Furthermore, China's WTO membership in 2001 became another turning point for FDI in China. This membership sent a message that the Chinese government would create an environment for investment that accorded with international rules, and it paves way for deregulation such as the gradual elimination of foreign capital regulations in service industries. The Indian economic policy, on the other hand, still has marked remnants of protectionism for domestic industries, and there are still many significant barriers to investment in the country. However, IT services and software in India have seen a tremendous amount of investment, which primarily from European and US firms. Unlike Chinese investment that cover various industries ranging from manufacturing industries to retail and financial services, Indian investments are primarily in the automotive industry. Following Deng's policies, which began in 1978, China was open to trade and the ban on direct investment from foreign countries were lifted. A year later, the Joint Management Law was passed, creating institutional foundations for enticing foreign firms through the introduction of foreign capital, transfer of technology, and promotion of exports. Moreover, the government established four economic zones, which include Shenzhen, Zhuhai, Shantou, and Xiamen, to experiment with economic development models to attract foreign firms. The country opened 14 coastal cities to foreign investment and lifted regional restrictions on independent investment by foreign firms in 1984 and 1986, respectively. By 1988, almost all coastal regions become a part of the Coastal Economic Liberalization Zone through the government's implementation of a Coastal Zone Economic Development Strategy. Moreover, as a result of Deng's 1992 Southern Tour speech, market reforms accelerated and the investment of foreign capital into the country began in earnest. Coupled with the country's WTO membership and further loosening of foreign capital restrictions in the service industries, China saw a dramatic rise in the amount of direct investment. The methods of capitalization in China include independent foreign capitalizations and joint capitalization in the form of joint venture with Chinese firms. And in the 11th five-year plan that began in 2006, the Chinese government clarified its stance on selection of investments by foreign firms and outlined its goal for becoming a technology nation with heightened competitiveness of Chinese firms. The regulation in India began in 1980 when Indira Gandhi became the prime minister and was done in an extremely closed market with extraordinarily strict regulations on trade. In the latter half of the 80s, India fell into budget deficits and received assistance from the IMF and World Bank. From early 90s, India worked to rebuild the country by implementing new economic policies. A major turning point on foreign capital regulations occurred in 2002, where the Indian government's Department of Commerce changed the theretofore one-off approval systems for direct investments into a negative system. In doing so, industries not on a government list were automatically granted investment approval. Additionally, India enacted an economic zone law in 2005, and as a result, hundreds of plans for constructions are said to currently exist throughout the country. The difference in political structures between China and India leads to very different investment environments from the perspective of foreign firms. The Communist Party of China makes it so that its legislative body, the National People's Congress, not only fulfills its responsibility as a lawmaking organ, but also acts as a supreme authority, even in areas of administration, judiciary, and prosecution. Almost all important policy decisions for the country are essentially made by the Communist Party's Central Committee. The country also implemented coherent policies with the aim of economic development through investment of foreign firms. On the other hand, India followed a democratic path. The country has many political parties, and it is difficult for one party to gain a majority, so coalitions are the norm. After the general elections in 2009, a coalition led by the Indian National Congress became the ruling party and they take up liberal policies of economic reforms, while the other coalition, BJP, favors conservative policies for domestic protectionism. During election time, the opinions of the country's farmers are important, and domestic policies are the top priority. Additionally, administering a government is difficult since there are so many political parties in the country. China is primarily driven by the government through organizations, state-owned companies, and laws. Their bureaucracy has spread its net wide across economic activities, making it impossible to do business without touching its network. However, it makes the risk management for companies relatively easier as governments shoulder a portion of the risk. Furthermore, the behavior of economic entities in the country follows the informal rules of a socialist state. Unlike China, India is primarily driven by private companies that compete in the midst of market mechanism. These companies assess risk and rewards under the mechanism of a market economy and then engage in business activities. To complement market mechanism, the government creates codified rules such as corporate and labor laws as well as financial market regulations. As China and India have great differences in their institutions, the level of efficiencies in diverse markets such as product, capital, and labor markets will differ as well. Thus, it creates institutional fights. Economic institutions such as products, capital, or labor market that have matured in developed nations but have not reached a sufficient level of maturity in emerging markets, thus creating a fight. There are four classifications of fights. The first one is fights in product markets, which are determined by the extent products and services can be purchased and whether market thickness can be secured. When comparing China and India on these points, China might be said to have relatively smaller fights. For instance, China is more efficient. Second is fights in capital markets, where the main differences between China and India are that India has smaller fights, thus more efficient market than in China. Meanwhile, in China, the information asymmetry between companies and investors are a big concern. The third one is fights in labor markets that is determined by how efficiently labor demand is matched with supply. In China, this fight is relatively smaller compared to India. The last one is macro environments related to institutions, which encompass many areas including foreign capital regulations, broadcasting regulations, and regulations on the activities of foreign firms. Following the global strategy based on China's institutional fights, it is to select one of the following depending on the circumstances. One is to replicate domestic business, or two is to adapt to the local environment. The former should be selected to achieve economies of scale or to leverage a global brand, while the latter should be selected when voids are too large and a strategy of replication is unrealistic. Concluding our discussion, institutional market is an important topic studied within institutional economics, including informal institutions that have implications in terms of global strategy as well, be it the informal rules, the relationship with government, or risk management. And that just about covers it. Thank you.